Could Spencer Rattler indeed be one of the best quarterbacks in the country? And how could South Carolina fare against Mississippi State this weekend? I'm joined by Locked On SEC host Chris Gordy to dive into all of that and more on today's Locked On Gamecocks.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day, both on YouTube and also wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. I am Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also a staff writer for Gamecocks Digest over on SI.com. Thank y'all so much for making us your daily watch or listen for South Carolina Gamecock sports coverage. Today's show is brought to you by Jace Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jace case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics and treat 50-plus infections. Get yours today at jacemedical.com. That's J-A-S-E medical.com. And for today's show, I am joined by a special guest and Locked On SEC host, Chris Gordy. Chris, we're in the thick of the 2023 college football season. How have things been going on your end, my man?
Well, you know, Andrew, I've been having to answer all these stupid questions over the last couple of weeks. Like, why is the SEC stink? Why is it the dying conference? Why are they losing every big game? I mean, you know, it's little things like that. But hopefully, here the next couple of weeks, we'll start to see the parity of the SEC and find that some teams are maybe a little bit better than we initially thought.
Yeah, for sure. I can only imagine the amount of questions that you've had hurled your way regarding that topic, and we're definitely going to be sure to touch on that later in the show. But Chris, I want to start off, of course, with South Carolina, because the Gamecocks, they've had some positives and also some negatives on their football team sort of to start this football season when it comes to their performance on the football field. And the biggest positive by far has been quarterback Spencer Rattler, a quarterback that obviously has had a roller coaster of a career to this point, and somebody that got a lot of hype in the Columbia area throughout the offseason. And it seemed like that a lot of the national media, they were kind of like, you know what, we're going to be in a wait-and-see kind of approach when it comes to Spencer Rattler this time around. And Chris, the way he's performed so far, I think that you could make the case he might be the best quarterback in the SEC, and maybe, just maybe, he's back in the conversation of being one of the best quarterbacks in the country, especially when you consider all of the other negatives that have been occurring on South Carolina's offense. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Yeah, he has been the bright spot of the team this year, but unfortunately, the downer of what I was most concerned with this team throughout the offseason was the offensive line and protecting him. You know, I made this statement a couple weeks ago, and it still holds true. If you give Spencer Rattler time to throw, he will find his guy and he will kill you. The problem is the O-line is not giving him time to throw. We saw that obviously against North Carolina. It was a mixed bag. When they protected him, they gave him time to throw. He completed big passes. Xavier Leggett was awesome. He's been awesome. But 9 sacks against North Carolina. And then this past week against Georgia, not as many sacks, but a lot of hits. I mean, constantly under pressure. And it was really a tale of two halves. You could see where Georgia made the second half adjustments or the halftime adjustments. And that second half, man, it just felt like they couldn't do anything. So, but look, Spencer's still Spencer. He's a warrior. Every week on our Locked On SEC show, I give winners and losers of the weekend. And I included Spencer Rattler as kind of an honorable mention of my winners of the weekend, because I just thought he deserved credit for how he battled out there, got South Carolina out to that early lead. Obviously, not great in the second half, but I just thought he battled. He tried to keep the game, the team in it. A couple interceptions, obviously not great, but with no run game and offensive line as not great as they are, I think Spencer Rattler is playing as well as he can. And I think a lot of NFL scouts are recognizing that as well, taking those notes that he has really, really battled out there.
Yeah, Chris, in a weird way, it kind of feels like that Spencer Rattler has garnered a lot more respect, especially from those NFL scouts that you mentioned, because of the fact that, hey, he is not playing in perfect circumstances right now. You know, every other play, he is taking a hit or he's having to run for his life outside the pocket. He's got little to no run game to speak up behind him. I think South Carolina ranks dead last in terms of rushing offense in the SEC, and yet despite all that, he is still going out there and putting on a show for at least, a good portion of these ball games against really, really good competition. So Spencer Rattler, I think it's definitely fair to say he has upped his stock, even though we're only 3 games into the 2023 season. And Chris, that leads me to my next question. Dowell Loggains, obviously a hire that garnered in some ways some criticism, and in other ways maybe just some fair questions this past offseason. A guy that had been in the NFL for a very long time. Things did not work out there. He goes to Arkansas, his alma mater, for a couple years as their tight ends coach, and then Shane Beamer hires him this past December. And quite frankly, a lot of people sort of were scratching their head over the hire because they didn't really see maybe what this guy could bring to this offense. And I guess that leads into my question about Loggains, which is, if Spencer Rattler's doing really good right now, Chris, do you think that that means that Dal Loggins deserve a lot of praise as well? Or do you think that maybe we still need to give him some time to see what kind of coordinator he's going to be in the SEC?
I think he deserves some credit. I know fans were very critical of Marcus Satterfield last year, and they had their reasons. I mean,
Yeah.
Rattler's numbers earlier in the year were not great, and then later in the year they take off, and we see this explosion of offense against Tennessee, and it was just like, where was that all earlier in the year? The constant telling us they're going to use Jaheim Bell, and then we never see it. It was just like all these weird, inconsistent things. So it does feel like an improvement from that standpoint now with Loggains. And yeah, I was one of those critical people. It wasn't a sexy hire. When you get rid of Satterfield and you had all these big names out there like, Lincoln Riley's brother and, Kendall Briles, and, there were all these names out there available floated around, and it just wasn't one of the sexy hires. But then I deferred to my people I talked to in Arkansas who said they loved him there and said South Carolina's getting a really good coach. So, Shane Beamer was very defensive about it in the spring. Remember, he was like going to bat for him, going, you guys don't even know who this guy is. He's going to be awesome. So, yeah, I think the jury is still out. I'd say probably more of a passing grade than a fail so far, but they have to develop a rush or a running game. They've got to find some way to do it. I know they've tried the Carrion Joyner there. I know they've tried, Mario Anderson's had some carries. Juju McDowell I had high hopes for him. He just doesn't look like he's a consistent running back at this level. And it's magnified a little bit, Andrew, when I'm watching USC the last couple of weeks, and Marshawn Lloyd is their leading rusher for the Trojans. And it just sucks because I'm like, why did that guy leave? He should have stayed at USC, and I think they'd be a little bit better with him there. So regardless, run game's got to improve, and then, pass protection. They just got to do their best. I understand it is what it is. You lose an O-lineman this week for the season, but I think they just got to figure out ways to either get the ball out of Spencer's hands quicker, because, man, when he's holding it back there and it's 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, that pass rush is closing on him, and it's a sack. So, again, passing grade so far, but a lot of areas still need to improve on the offense.
Yeah, and there's definitely been some changes made so far this season. You saw true freshman Tree Babalade, a very highly touted offensive tackle prospect from this past year's recruiting cycle. He's now starting at left tackle, which certainly not easy for anybody to do, especially in the SEC. And Chris, I'll go ahead and tell you, you might see 2 true freshmen starting on the offensive line this Saturday night when they take on Mississippi State. So definitely some moving pieces there, and maybe some moving pieces at running back. We'll see sort of how that rotation works out this weekend against the Bulldogs. And that kind of leads me into the beginning of our conversation about Mississippi State, Chris, because this sort of feels like it is a really important game for both teams. South Carolina, you don't want to start off 1-3, especially when you still have some really big time games coming up on the road at Tennessee. You got to play a Florida team that looks like maybe they're finding their stride a little bit. You got to play at Missouri, who just got maybe the biggest win of Eli Drinkwitz's tenure this past weekend against Kansas State. And you got to play at Texas A&M, who's going to be looking for revenge after you defeated them last year. And then Mississippi State, they got to play Bama, they got to play at Arkansas and at Auburn all the next 4 weeks after this weekend's game. So, Chris, do you think that this is a must-win game for both of these programs?
It feels like one that Shane Beamer's really got to win, especially being sub 500 right now, sitting at 1-2. Because the road trip at Tennessee next week is going to be brutal. They just got embarrassed by Florida. Josh Heupel's going to do everything he can do to fix Joe Milton and get him back on track. Florida, looks like they got back on track, getting their starting center back in there. At Missouri, they just beat Kansas State. It's Como's becoming a tougher place to play, and then at A&M, we know how tough it is to play at Kyle Field. So, backstretch of the season, Vandy is winnable. Kentucky's winnable. Clemson, I don't know. We'll see what Clemson looks like when we get there. They looked like they were going to be good coming into the season, and then they've had a couple losses pile up already. So, I just think this feels like one that South Carolina, you're better than this Mississippi State team. Go win it. Go find a way to win it. It doesn't have to be pretty. It could be ugly, but as long as you got more points on the scoreboard at the end of the game, that's all that matters. So, I'm with you, Andrew, because you lose this when you drop to 1-3. Man, it's tough to find 5 more wins on the schedule to get you to bowl eligibility. And it sucks because all the momentum that Shane Beamer built these last 2 seasons, all the momentum in recruiting, all this stuff that he's been doing, it would feel really just bad taste in the mouth if he goes 5-7. They don't even make a bowl game. So, I view this weekend as this is a must-win for South Carolina.
Yeah, Chris, Shane Beamer was asked, I believe, at his Tuesday press conference this week about this game, and I guess maybe if there's a stronger sense of urgency, I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said that they're treating this week's game like every other week, which, 100% coach speak there. I think that if Shane Beamer was given some truth serum, he would tell you that, this team, they got to win this game. There's no question about that. You mentioned, don't mess around. Go out there and take care of business early. And I definitely think that's going to be the kind of game they're going to be playing against a Mississippi State team that has a lot of storylines surrounding their program as well. And Chris and I are going to dive into Mississippi State and what else going on their side of things in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by Jace Medical. Now, everyone should be empowered to care for themselves and their loved ones during the unexpected. And that's why Jace Medical offers the Jace Case. The Jace Case provides 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use and gives you a peace of mind so that you're not just hoping that you have access to medication in an emergency. Jace Medical makes sure that you have the medication in hand. It is simple. They handle everything from the online evaluation to licensed pharmacy medication delivery and ongoing consultation and care. Don't get caught unprepared. Save more than $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jace Medical, plus an additional $20 off by using code LOCKEDON at checkout on jacemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com, promo code LOCKEDON. All right, continuing our conversation here with Locked On SEC host Chris Gordy. Chris, let's talk about the Mississippi State Bulldogs, because this has been a very intriguing team to follow, honestly, throughout the past 9.5, 10 months. Obviously, this past December was a really tragic month for that football program with the passing of Mike Leach, the sudden passing of Mike Leach. And Zach Arnett, he went from being the defensive coordinator to all of a sudden, he's now the man that's leading an SEC football program. And there's been a lot that's been going on since that time, him getting adjusted to the role, him kind of overhauling the staff, and also maybe changing up the philosophy of one side of the ball, which we'll touch on in a moment. But, Chris, my overall question with Zach Arnett is, what do you think of his job performance so far, now that 9.5 months has passed?
Look, I was singing his praises after the first 2 weeks, and understand, they opened with Southeastern Louisiana, who they're way better than, but, slow out of the gates, and then they, pulled away, poured it on late. And then against Arizona, it was a weird game where it felt like they kind of dominated much of the game. They had 4 turnovers or 4 interceptions, 5 turnovers against Arizona, and still had to go to overtime with them and win in overtime. But I liked what I was seeing from the run game. Woody Marks through the first 2 weeks was the leading rusher in the SEC. Offensive line appeared to be run blocking. Now, the passing game came way down. It was kind of weird because we talked about it coming into the season. Will Rogers, one of the most experienced, most productive quarterbacks in the country, not just the SEC, coming from that air raid Mike Leach system, and we just wondered how different it would look. You bring in Kevin Barbay from Appalachian State, and man, they've gone more traditional style, run the football, 2 wide receivers, 3 wide receivers, 11 personnel. Like, I don't know what made them want to go that route, but clearly, as we saw against LSU this past weekend, that might not be their approach. I mean, what was kind of fascinating was right before halftime, they get into their 2-minute offense and they start putting 4 wide receivers out there. Suddenly you start to see Will Rogers look a little bit more comfortable. And then they went away from it. I'm like, dude, like, you got to go with what your quarterback likes, what he's used to. And I start to question the hire completely. Like, look, Zach Arnett did a really good job with that defense. I think he's a really good defensive mind. And I think he can be okay as a head coach. But I don't understand why they didn't go out and find an OC that runs an air raid that could have come in and just picked up right where Mike Leach's system left off. It reminds me a lot, Andrew, years ago when Bobby Petrino left Arkansas and they hired Brett Bielema. Brett Bielema comes in and goes, yeah, we want that Big Ten mentality of big offensive line and power football. And he looked around the roster and they went, dude, you don't have that. Like, that's not what Bobby Petrino ran. So it was almost like he had to re-recruit, his entire roster and get in people that fit his system. And that's what you're looking at Mississippi State is you got an entire team fit for an air raid system and you're not running air raid. So it's a mess. I don't know what Mississippi State's identity is. Like I said, the first 2 weeks, they look like a run first team and it looked pretty good. And then LSU bottled that up and said, what else you got? And they couldn't pass protect. Will Rogers looked confused. I mean, it was just, and they were at home. Like, that's the craziest part about it. So maybe you're catching these guys at the right time where they really don't know what they are. They don't know their identity. And I know they're going to be tough defensively, even though LSU kind of, made work out of them. I think we're going to find as the year goes along, LSU is one of the best offenses in the country. I know everybody crapped on them when they lost to Florida State week 1. People ignored, they still put up 450 yards of offense at Florida State. And they currently lead the SEC. They're the number 1 offense in the SEC in terms of yards per game. So, I think Mississippi State defensively, they're going to come in hard-nosed, ready to go. They got some great linebackers, Jet Johnson, Boogie Watson, all those guys that they play really hard. Jaden Crumity got into the backfield a couple of times last week against LSU. They're going to try to get after Spencer Rattler and disrupt him. And, Spencer's got to take care of the football. No turnovers this week, but again, this is probably the right time to catch Mississippi State where they're going through a flux of they don't really know who they are with an identity on offense.
Yeah, Chris, the ironic part about this weekend's matchup is South Carolina fans, they might watch what Mississippi State does offensively, where it feels like they're trying to put a square peg into a round hole with the personnel and the system they're trying to run. And it's going to remind, I think, Gamecock fans of Marcus Satterfield because, again, I mean, the Gamecocks clearly did not have the personnel the last 2 years to run a conventional, traditional pro-style offense, and yet that's what Marcus Satterfield tried to employ here. And it's why, even when Spencer Rattler got here, one of the best quarterbacks that you've had talent-wise ever in your football program's history, they were still sputtering out the gate until finally they realized, hey, maybe if we just simplify things a little bit, things will actually work a little better. And of course, that's what happened. So, maybe the same thing happens with Zach Arnett's squad, but you're certainly right. They look completely out of sorts last weekend against LSU, and South Carolina, they may be catching them at the right time. And these guys have yet to play on the road this year, so that might just make things even worse for them on Saturday night. Chris, to get your final thoughts on this game, FanDuel currently has this line set at -6.5 points. It started out at -4.5 points, so this line's already bumped up 2 whole points since Sunday afternoon. Do you have the Gamecocks winning this game? And if so, do you think they cover currently that 6.5 point spread set by FanDuel?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a world, like if I could script it out and South Carolina wins this game, yeah, they're winning by at least a touchdown. So, that's where I would lean, money wise if I were betting. But I think, the line movement, I think, is a little bit of an overreaction to what we saw last week. It's funny. LSU's hosting Arkansas this week. A week ago, that early line was about LSU -8.5. LSU goes and beats Mississippi State 41-14, and Arkansas loses at home to BYU, a team they were favored against. Suddenly that line moved to 18.5. So it's just so crazy how quickly 1 week can change our mind on what we think of teams. And, we see Mississippi State get bludgeoned by LSU. Suddenly, South Carolina 4 points. No, how about more closer to a touchdown favorite? Because people think, look, South Carolina gave Georgia their best effort. And, I would have been fascinated to see, Andrew, had that game been in Columbia, is that one that South Carolina pulls out? Again, Georgia had the benefit of being at home, made the halftime adjustments, figured out how to run the football. That was the big thing. Them getting Dejon Edwards back. If they hadn't gotten Dejon Edwards back, I don't even know if the run game produces this past week for Georgia. So there were just so many things that went into their favor. But again, I know Shane Beamer was very, very upset after the game and said, look, we just, we can say we just went toe-to-toe with the best team in the country, the number one team. And I think South Carolina has a lot to be proud of, but what they do need to do is hit that reset button, understand what their record is. What's the old saying? You are what your record says you are. You're 1-2. Let's regroup. Let's find a way to win this one. And again, I think I think those points are probably accurate. They just got to protect. They got to protect and get some of these other offensive weapons involved. And even if it's not a run game, get something. Maybe some more end arounds, maybe some jet sweeps, something to get movement going where they're not just pinning their ears back and saying, let's just bull rush and get after Rattler.
Yeah. And, Chris, you talk about how competitive South Carolina was against the Georgia Bulldogs. I've had some talks, of course, with a lot of the Locked On Gamecock fans that watch and listen to the show this week. And I sort of reminded some people on the Monday show, I said, look, y'all, the last 3 years, South Carolina, they were out of the game by halftime when they played Georgia. I mean, Georgia ran away with it. And now this year, you're upset because the Gamecocks, they feel like they let one slip away. And sure, that probably was the case in a sense. They did let one get away from them. But at the same time, I do think that goes to show just how much the program has progressed under Shane Beamer's watch. And, if they can get some more depth at really important positions, then hey, maybe a couple years down the line, that game ends up differently. And we'll, of course, see as Shane Beamer continues to try to instill his image and his imprint on this football program. And the fact that Georgia, it took them 30 minutes to really start to get things going, maybe that means that there is more parity in the SEC this year. Maybe it's a down year for the conference. I'm going to ask Chris Gordy about his opinions on all of that in just a couple of moments. Today's show is also brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. The NFL season, it is fully underway. A lot of incredible games so far throughout the first 2 weeks. And if you want to make some money on some of these NFL games, right now, if you join FanDuel, you can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Again, that is $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. Right now is the best time to join FanDuel. The app is easy to use, and you can bet on everything from spreads to player props and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel is the official betting partner of the NFL. All right, Chris, let's now zoom out a little bit and let's look at the entire SEC because so far this year, admittedly, the SEC has not showed up quite well in some of these non-conference Power 5 games. Admittedly, South Carolina, they own a piece of the blame pie on that one because of the fact that they did not show up against North Carolina in week 1. Obviously, Arkansas loses to a BYU team that they were favored to beat at home this past weekend. It's just a recent example. Florida State blows out LSU in week 1, or at least by the scoreboard. By looking at the scoreboard, they ran away with that one. The SEC just has not shown up in a ton of these games. So, Chris, I'll just go ahead and ask you, is this a down year for the SEC, or do they just need some time to get things going?
I mean, it does feel like through the first 3 weeks, and it could be technically a down year because they've lost a lot of the non-conference games. But I will say, Texas beating Alabama was not a shocker. Texas played like the better team that day. Florida State beat LSU. That was not a shocker because, they play like the better team that day. And, the 2 week 1 games, look, Utah was favored to beat Florida. They beat them. North Carolina was favored to beat you guys, and they beat them. So I don't, those aren't ones that I can necessarily look at and go, those were crazy losses for the SEC. The BYU one was a bad one. That was one for Arkansas that they should have won. But, look, I can look at other ones where Mizzou beats Kansas State. That was unexpected. Congrats to, Eli Drinkwitz. He thought he had a lot of pressure on him, get that contract extension. He's already lived up to it. All the talk and the hype for Tennessee, I think we neglected. Maybe Florida's not as bad as everybody was making them out to be. One of my bold predictions coming into the year was I said Florida, if they can stay healthy, that they're going to lead. They're going to be one of the top 5 rushing teams in the SEC this year. And we already saw they get their starting center Kingsley Aguakin back, and suddenly Trevor Etienne, Montrell Johnson, they're running wild, and they're up to number 6 in the SEC in rushing now. So I think Florida is going to be a little bit better. Kentucky looks pretty good so far with Devin Leary at quarterback, though they haven't really been tested yet. I love how Kentucky's schedule set up. They play like 3 nobodies, and then their first conference game is at Vandy. Like if Kentucky's not
Every single year.
Yeah, if Kentucky's not 4-0 next week, then they got problems. Missouri, the way they look right now, the next couple games, if they beat Memphis and some of these games, like they could be 5-0 going into hosting LSU in a couple weeks. So that one's kind of interesting. Like, maybe Mizzou is a little bit better than we gave them credit for. Ole Miss is doing their customary, hey, we're winning all our early season games, but we saw this a year ago where, they started 7-0 and then suddenly all the losses start to pile up because they play tougher competition. Texas A&M, I think they are, back on the rise. Everybody, crapped on them for their performance against Miami, but their offense was pretty stinking good. The defense was not good that day. DJ Durkin, I thought, didn't do a very good job. But that said, if they beat Auburn this weekend, start 1-0 in SEC play, I think A&M could start to run off a bunch of wins. And, like I said, Auburn is kind of that wild card team right now. Like Hugh Freeze is there. I think maybe not in year one, but I think down the road, they're going to start to build something really, really, really strong there. And then, of course, Alabama. They're just a mess right now at quarterback, but they're going back to Jalen Milroe this week. If they beat Ole Miss in Oxford or Ole Miss in Tuscaloosa, they'll feel good about themselves. And who knows, maybe Alabama has a chance to right their positioning and start to run off a bunch of wins. So, yeah, it's technically by the letter of the law probably a down year for the SEC, but I still think there's a lot of strong teams that can really make some noise this year before it's all said and done.
Yeah, you do look at it, some of those non-conference matchups that SEC teams have lost, they've been facing some of the top teams in other Power 5 conferences. And so maybe that is a bit misleading. And, it shouldn't necessarily send the message to people that the depth has gotten worse. This is still a very deep conference. And again, it is early in the season. We got plenty of games to go. So maybe by the end of the year, the SEC, it's right back to, the SEC, they are still definitely the best conference in college football, and they're going to have the best athletes and the best coaches. So I definitely agree with your sentiment on that. I guess the one final question that I have for you, Chris, and again, really appreciate you coming on to today's show. Behind Georgia in the SEC East, assuming that, that second half of the South Carolina game, maybe they did figure things out, and now they're going to start rolling for the rest of the way. Does it feel like that second place is still wide open, maybe even more wide open than we suspected coming into this season?
Yeah, I think so, because like I said a few minutes ago, I'm still bullish on Florida. I think they're going to be better than we're giving them credit for, but their schedule's still brutal. And so the losses could pile up there. Kentucky, we'll see. I'm optimistic on them. They've passed the smell test so far, but once you get an SEC play, you never know. And, they could start to lose. Mizzou could start to lose. We expect Vandy will fall off to the bottom where they typically are. And then the biggest question is, Andrew, what is Tennessee? Is Joe Milton, okay, we know right now he's not Hendon Hooker, but can he be fixed? Can Josh Heupel retool, fix what the issues are there? Keep in mind, they've not had their starting center play any game this year in Cooper Mays. They were talking about how he's the straw that stirs the drink of that offense. When he's in there, he's the one dictating the tempo where they run, what was the average? 3 plays a minute. Like if they get Cooper Mays back in there, Squirrel White, Ramel Keaton, Brew McCoy, all those receivers, if they're on the same page with Joe Milton and they fix that chemistry, then hey, maybe Tennessee is legit and they can be that team that runs off a bunch of wins and finishes second in the East. But to your point, right now, yeah, this thing appears wide open, even for an 0-1 South Carolina team that just went toe-to-toe with the best team in Georgia. Who knows? If they take care of their business, win some of these games at home that they're supposed to, yeah, you could maybe find, maybe it's 2 losses in the SEC or 3 losses. Maybe that's what that team is that finishes second in the East. Because again, Georgia's schedule is stupid, but I still think there's a chance Georgia trips up and loses a game somewhere along the way. And then what does that mean head-to-head with somebody else? So, this thing is wide open. And, hey, look, the Gamecocks, they got to take care of themselves. They can't worry about who's next or who's ahead of them, who's on their schedule. You got to do the little things, try to find some run game, continue to try to protect Spencer Rattler, and try to force some turnovers. I was encouraged by the defensive effort I saw on Saturday from the Gamecock defense. I had some big questions about them up front. I think they're starting to get better and better. So, let's see what they can do defensively, force some turnovers, and maybe steal some more games this season.
Certainly a lot of intriguing storylines to follow as the SEC football season continues to roll on. Chris, thank you once again for coming on to today's show. For those of you who want more SEC football content, be sure to go and follow Chris Gordy at Chris Gordy on X or Twitter or whatever the heck you call it these days. And also be sure to go give Locked On SEC a watch or listen, whether it's on YouTube or wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. For all you Locked On Gamecock viewers and listeners, have a great rest of your Wednesday, and I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.